very new and very, very exciting work on the eradication of smallpox in India and China. And while most of us have no public memory of this disease, it truly is one of those sort of terrifying things which kind of got the global community together. To give an example, the circulation of the vaccine was a moment where Cold War hostilities were sort of suspended. Former Soviet Union was supplying freeze-dried vaccines around the world. And even today, I mean, I think in some traditional North Indian weddings, you still have a ceremony around Sitla Devi, which is worshipping the goddess of the smallpox vaccine. And the history that Professor Singh will take us through begins somewhat in the early 19th century, coming all the way down to the 20th century, 1960s, when the Generian vaccine was sort of pushed through and eradication of smallpox happened. She's widely acknowledged for her path-breaking work globally on social welfare, particularly on the role of social solidarity in development, and development imagined as freedom. And I think pretty much everybody over here knows me. Those who don't or who have forgotten, I am a fellow with the Human Development team, and my work focuses on political economy of health and education. So very excited. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Priyadarshini. Thank you to you all for coming. I'm sure you all have 1,000 different things happening. So I really appreciate your time and hopefully your engagement. As Priyadarshini mentioned, this is ongoing work. And so it's actually the best time. It's ongoing work, and yet I think most of the ideas have taken some kind of crystallized form such that I can share them with you. And so it's a really great time to be here, and thank you for this. So I thought it might be helpful to actually start by just talking a little bit about what my trajectory of my research has been. And much of it has been around this question broadly defined of how do we promote human flourishing or freedom, as Priyadarshini said. And I've looked at it in two broad areas. One is questions of social welfare. And the second is broadly what we might think of as us and them relations, identity politics. And so within us and them relations, and I'll talk about that very briefly first, because it won't be so much explicitly the focus of what I'll be speaking on today. I've written a lot on the causes and consequences of ethnic politics. And within the causes of ethnic politics, really tried to emphasize the role of the state, in particular, the role of state institutions. And so with Evan Lieberman, I have a bunch of articles that looks at every census conducted in the world from 1780 onwards, codes it for whether or not it counted ethnicity, and then makes a connection between counting ethnic categories on the census and mobilization and eventually conflict along those categories as a way to talk about the role of the state, often in very innocuous, everyday, mundane, regularized forms in creating ethnic identities. I've also written a lot about the role of inclusive nationalism, which is another way to kind of bridge us and them identities. Within the consequences, I've talked, and this is related to more what I'll be speaking about, how the relationship between ethnic politics, identity politics, and public goods provision. And within public goods provision, I've focused a lot on education and health, but across my research, and kind of writing a second book allows you to take a bit of a step back and say, okay, what is my contribution across all my work? And much of it, I think, is trying to move our understanding away from a dominant and hegemonic fascination, even though it's much criticized since Sen's rational fools argument, this idea that humans are driven primarily by cost-benefit maximization, that we are rational actors, homo economicus, and to try to really emphasize the way in which we are also motivated by what I call moral concerns and questions of solidarity, identities, norms, values, and worldviews. And so one way to describe the book that Priyadarshini so generously referenced is to talk about how social solidarity influenced the way in which political leaders across Indian states put in place or chose not to put in place education and health policies. And this was a comparison of Indian states, in particular, looking at states in the north and the south to try to understand this established and well-known pattern of why states in southern India, especially Kerala and Tamil Nadu, seem to do a lot better than what we call the Bimaru Hindi heartland. And as you'll see from the talk today, a lot of my work really tries to look historically and draw conclusions and inferences for the present day. And so the book really traced the beginnings of language movements, which led to the creation of linguistic federalism, about it today, and the way in which language-based sub-nationalism or social solidarity was a very important driver for political elites to prioritize education and health. So one way, again, to think about what I'm doing is an extension of that work to move from a focus on health and education to focus on the control of contagion. But as I admitted to Sandhya at the beginning, I'm not really so much a public health scholar as I'm interested in infectious disease and contagion as a way to say something about the relationship between state and society. And so, COVID was this tragic, ongoing, grim reminder of the threat that infectious disease has posed to mankind. But it's important to keep in mind that pretty much since settled agriculture and the domestication of animals, infectious diseases have remained the single most important existential threat to the human race. They've killed more than all wars and natural disasters combined. And even in wars, military historians will tell you, which was something of a revelation to me, that more people die of disease in the barracks than they die of deaths inflicted from actual active combat. So infectious disease has really changed the course of world history. I'm happy to talk about all the different ways that it has, but everything from Alexander died of malaria, Napoleon's expedition to Soviet Union was derailed because of typhus among the troops, the decline of empires from Athens, the outbreak of the plague, to the Ming, to the success of revolution. So the Haitian Revolution, the first free slave state, was because of the slave army's resistance to yellow fever, which Napoleon's troops did not have. So many historical detours that I could take you to try to kind of help you understand the importance of infectious disease as for a political scientist. And also in terms of economic consequences, Acemoglu and Robinson just got the Nobel for economics, and the Nobel Prize Committee was very specific. They got it for that one article. And in that article, the basic insight is that infectious disease gives rise to settler mortality. Where settlers die more, they are more likely to have extractive institutions and not settle. And that eventually gives rise to long-term consequences for economic and social development. So if you really kind of trace the Acemoglu and Robinson Nobel Prize winning argument, it really goes back to differences in the infectious disease environments that they faced in the different parts of the world, particularly Latin America versus South Asia. Latin America had a much more welcoming environment for them. They were happy to settle. South Asia didn't. And so they really just wanted to colonize India with about 200 Scotsmen. So the 20th century sees what is called the bacteriological revolution, mostly antibiotics and vaccines, and it changes the course of human history. So a massive rise in life expectancy, drop in infant mortality. But despite this, we still continue to face the threat of vector-borne diseases, and climate change is only going to make this a lot worse. Any model that you have of the way in which climate change is giving rise to new pathogens, increasing our vulnerability to existing pathogens, makes for pretty terrifying reading. So in addition, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, is that, of course, we fear infectious disease. The US is scared about Ebola in West Africa in the way that poverty in West Africa does not scare it at all. And the reason is not just because of these deadly consequences, but because of its really chilling, stealthy mode of transmission, the fact that germs will cross even more tightly policed borders. And this, even though disease doesn't respect borders, borders have historically structured our vulnerability to infectious disease. And this forms the basis for the research question of the book, which is why do places, even with broadly shared epidemiological, demographic, and socioeconomic conditions, differ quite starkly in the way that they've been able to deal with the same infectious disease? And analytically, I'm going to take you through a model that says that in order to control infectious disease, you need state commitment. The state needs to kind of say, okay, this is a priority. You need to provide and implement, and that's frontline provision. And finally, and critically, you need societal cooperation. And in the literature on what gets called state capacity, the focus has really been on this element of provision, implementation. And I really want to kind of broaden that and say we should be looking equally at the drivers of state commitment, but even more importantly, at the drivers of societal cooperation. And as I said, I'm a political scientist, a comparative political scientist. So for me, public health is a case of a broader set of policies, domains in which it's not just sufficient to have state commitment. So Chandrayaan, for instance, right? India can put a lunar mission on the dark side of the moon. That does not require popular compliance. That is something that's happening at the highest echelons of policy making. But a lot of core state functions require not just great policy at the quote unquote head of the state, they also require popular compliance. And for me, public health is a really good example of those kinds of policies. And so think, for instance, here, if we think of, on the left-hand side, we have things like foreign affairs, macroeconomic policy, climate policy, kind of policy making that does not require the state to interact with its citizens. Kind of going down, we hit things like getting people to pay their taxes, getting people to social distance, to use toilets that are provided. And all of those, to me, are kind of a very similar case of similar types of domains that require popular compliance. Okay. It's really important. And it's every time, this is more for a US audience, every time they hear this, they say, well, in India, it's a provision story. And it always takes a little bit to tell them, no, it's not. India actually is not as bad at provision as you might expect. Often the problem is one of compliance. And I think toilets is one aspect of it. We can put toilets there, but how do we get people to stop defecating in the open? Vaccine hesitancy, though, is a clear example of this. You can see this in the US. The US has no problem providing vaccines. The problem is people's lack of acceptance of them. And just to kind of remind you that vaccine hesitancy was considered a global threat way before COVID. So 2019, the World Development Report, the WHO, ranked it as number 3 in the top threats to global public health. Okay, and just as vaccines are interesting because they're also a collective action problem, right? If you were completely rational, you wouldn't actually get vaccinated. You would free ride on others' immunity to save yourself the slight risk that every vaccine does entail. So, for me, it's, so for the kind of political science kind of geeks are here, it is very much also a kind of instance in which we can have insights about other collective action problems. And dominant explanations, the ones that I'm arguing against, would say that all 3 of these steps, why do states commit, why does the frontline provide, and why do people cooperate, are really dominated by what I'm calling rational logics. And what do I mean by this? Essentially, if you look at the scholarship, why do states commit to anything, right? I think of this model as not just about public health, but really about a variety of domains. The scholarship will really emphasize material conditions. So you will commit when you can afford to commit, or it will follow naturally. So of course, if you have a kind of ethnically diverse population, that creates problems, and therefore you will have bad policy or lack of commitment to education and health. So again, those are material drivers, or it is strategic logics. So even those who say, okay, democracy is better, which by the way is an open question. Lots of scholarship says it is, much scholarship says it's not necessarily. But the logic there is also, okay, why do political leaders and democracies commit to, for instance, public health? Or they do it because otherwise they'll be punished at the ballot box. So again, for me, that's a rational logic of strategic interest maximizing political elites. Same logic about why greater degree of political competition, or well, greater competition, a greater risk of being voted out of office, therefore more of an impetus. The same rational logic dominates the question of why does the frontline provide? So look at all the JPAL work, Band-Aid on a Corpse, Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, right? It's the same logic. How do we get the frontline to do their job? We monitor them. We monitor them, we sanction them, we punish them, or we incentivize them. And yet we know from a vast scholarship that this way of thinking about frontline provision as a principal agent model has a number of shortcomings. One is temporal persistence. Matters for a little bit, you install that video camera that clocks someone coming in, month, 2 month, third month, the results begin to taper, right? A shifting of efforts, instead of actually doing their job, people shift their efforts to avoid being detected at not doing their job. It also reduces complex tasks to observable compliance. So the teacher will show up, clock in and then disappear for the rest of the day or not bother teaching. And also, especially the offering of fiscal incentives, which is far more widespread than you can imagine. Getting into the scholarship, which was not the topic of my research, was really eye-opening to me. It raises possibilities of corruption. Of course, it's massively costly to continue to monitor your own employees. And most dangerously, there is a powerful scholarship that talks about how this kind of command and control, sticks and carrots measures actually crowds out people's intrinsic motivations to do their job. And this scholarship is, to me, the most, I mean, if any of you want references, it is scattered, but it is so powerful. It actually goes back to a really interesting experiment that gave money to teenagers to play puzzles. These were people who said they really enjoyed doing puzzles, and so they offered them money to do these puzzles, and their interest in puzzles tapered off remarkably. And so this kind of led to this like really interesting body of research. Similarly, and I'll try to go through this quickly, similar logic for trying to get people to actually do what the state wants them to do. And this, again, if you read India in the 1950s and 60s, how quickly we resort to sticks and carrots is, again, a quite interesting community development program. Okay, they can't do it, offer them incentives. India has one of the first family planning programs in the world. So way before the emergency and the excesses of the emergency, we were offering people handsome sums of money to get vasectomies. Those incentives have now transferred to kind of female family planning. But again, this is a really powerful scholarship. I have an article out earlier this year in the Annual Review of Political Science in which I review some of this scholarship. And for those of you who are interested, a really great book is back in 1970 by a British historian called Richard Titmuss, who looked at blood donation and compared the US, where you get paid for blood donation, versus the UK, where blood donation is voluntary. And he found that paying people to donate their blood reduces the quantity of blood, but also the quality of blood that is donated, because that fiscal incentive leads people to hide pre-existing conditions that would not make them eligible for blood donation in a voluntary system. And that's a classic. But since then, paying people for vaccines makes them really suspicious. Well, what's wrong with this vaccine? It raises concerns about the risk, and has long legacy effects. So again, happy to talk about that, but these are the existing explanations that I'm going to try to move you away from, and instead take you into a domain in which what I call it the moral theory of contagion. And so I'm going to say it has less to do with everything I've tried to describe to you so far, even though that has been the thrust of the scholarship. And instead, we can think about states' commitment, state provision, and popular cooperation in terms of this iterative relationship between ideas and institutions of rule that form the moral fabric of state. I also did want to say, which I didn't before I set off, that if you have any questions that are impeding your understanding, please feel free to interrupt at any point and ask them, factual or just if you didn't understand what I said. Great. Okay, so I'm happy to talk about what I mean by ideas of rule, but I think of them as this kind of really important but underemphasized ideational firmament through which all policies across the world at different points in time have happened. There's never one idea of rule. It's usually a constellation. And I think it'll become more obvious when I talk about it, but this is really about beliefs and norms and culture and ideology, or what has been called a form of thought behavior, that underlying thought that kind of manifests in behavior. So I look at smallpox, as Priyadarshini said. I'm not going to tell you much, except that, again, I have at family dinners talked more about this disease than was appropriate, but it is historically one of the oldest killers and also the most deadly disease. But also, as Priyadarshini pointed out, talking about case studies, the only human disease we've as yet been able to eradicate. And you have to look at COVID vaccination to realize what a huge achievement this was. Imagine eradicating COVID. We did that with smallpox back in 1975. And this happens through this Jennerian vaccine, even though, as I'll try to tell you, I hate calling it the Jennerian vaccine because its roots are actually in a practice that originated in India in the 11th century. And Jenner's father was a variolator, which was a tikadar, actually. And he kind of really just modified on an existing technology. And it's very interesting because French histories will never say invented by Jenner. They'll say discovered by Jenner, while British histories will say invented by Jenner. So anyway, this vaccine comes in at 1798, and in 1975, smallpox is eradicated. So as a comparative political historian, it gives me a really clear temporal landscape across which to look at case comparisons in China and India, The smallpox vaccine arrives in China and India exactly the same point of time, 1803, through the same actor, the East India Company, the British East India Company. And yet there's about a 25-year lag, give and take, between when smallpox is eradicated in China and India. And I look at the comparison of the uptake of this vaccine in cities of Canton and Calcutta, which you'll hear a little bit more about, but also in the states of China and India. Okay, that's the outline of the book, but as you'll see, I'll mostly be focusing on the theoretical framework and then chapter 4, which is the 19th century comparison of these two cities of Canton and Calcutta. Everything kind of makes sense so far?
Yeah, I'm just thinking 1975 it was eradicated. I'm looking at the gray hair people. You remember it?
You would have gotten one. I can date you all.
Dark hair.
I can date anyone by looking at their upper arms. If you were born, it's true, it's true. No, you would have gotten it here.
Yeah, on the thigh.
Or on the thigh.
This horrible thing they used to get.
That was the tetanus, no, sorry, the typhoid. What was it called?
Or tuberculosis.
Diphtheria, something and typhoid.
Tiny scratches. We did it every year. They came and so they continued.
They could have. I mean, you know, honestly, the technology varied and it. No. So if you have a mark that's, as I do, that's often a BCG mark.
Yeah, BCG.
This
We
is
didn't
often
have BCG.
you don't, but then
We
there's
didn't
one
have
here
BCG.
on the
We had
thigh,
only
which is usually
smallpox.
smallpox. India continued its smallpox vaccination program. The states varied almost into 1981, 82.
Correct.
So if you were born before 81 July, give and take, you were vaccinated for smallpox. You might not have received a booster dose. In America, it stopped in 1955. So, I mean, if ever monkeypox, apparently smallpox gives you some immunity. So, you know, who knows, but yeah, no, not at all, not at all.
Now that you have stopped.
Yeah, please. No.
It was so fast, didn't want to interrupt.
Sorry. Yeah,
No,
please,
that's-
you can also just ask me to slow down. I have an 11-year-old, so I usually
Just
like
the-
give
the
instructions at a
question-
very,
Okay, so the question was, I mean, I've heard this story umpteen times that,
Yeah.
that this practice was prevalent in some parts of India.
yeah.
But why did it not spread in India?
It actually did spread and we had
So
actually.
why is it that almost all of my parents, grandparents, all of them suffered from smallpox in some way or another? I mean, so why is it if it was known for many centuries that it never spread?
It's a good question. So I think I would want to know how they got smallpox, like because okay, so maybe I'll just skip this. Okay, give me 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, just give me 1 second, just to tell you why. I mean, there are a lot of India-China comparisons floating out in the wild, but let me just tell you just for a second why I think it's a really good comparison for smallpox, which will answer your question. Okay, so one is they have very similar histories of smallpox. And also here we had something called variola major, which it had a much higher mortality rate. And also blindness, right? But smallpox was the #1 cause of blindness, if you look at census reports. Yeah. So either it killed you or it left you that pockmarked lunar landscape or it blinded you. So, you know, similar kind of epidemiological history, also very similar theory of causation, which was divine, which was through this goddess who's called Tou Shen Nyang Nyang in China. And of course, Sitla, as Priyadarshini said. These are representations of the goddess. But the worship of the goddess was very much within a very sophisticated regimen of treatment. And Harish Narayan Das at JNU has written a lot about this. So when you say that your parents and your grandparents got smallpox, depending on where in India you lived, but it was a quite widespread practice that they might have been given what is called a tika. And that tika was essentially giving them smallpox, but a very mild, attenuated case of smallpox. And so one of the reasons why this makes such a good comparison is because China and India both had this practice of, in a way, because all they knew about smallpox is that you got it once, you didn't get it again. Right? It granted you lifelong immunity. And so part of what the word tika did, was that a tikadar would come usually to your village with a very attenuated version of the pox. So say Sandhya had gotten smallpox, a very mild case, they might have come and taken some of the dust from the actual pox, let it kind of, you know, become milder. And then the following year, they will come around and the it was a very sophisticated technique and very similar to contemporary vaccine. So in it, they would usually make an incision into the upper arm. You would actually officially get smallpox, like technically you would get smallpox, but you would get it through this way of getting smallpox. The problem that the British had with this was that you were still contagious. So even though you were being variolated, or the word inoculation technically refers to variolation. It then gets co-opted to refer to vaccination more broadly, but inoculation is the technique of variolation, which is this technique of kind of giving you smallpox to protect you so that when an epidemic comes around, you already have immunity to it. The problem happened that, say, your mom sent you to school before you had completely recovered, then all the other kids who might not yet have been variolated could then contract smallpox. So when the British began to vilify variolation, they really went after this aspect of it. But variolation led to massive decreases in mortality in Europe in the 17th century, so pre-Jenner. The French had very high rates of variolation. So, I mean, I'm happy to kind of talk about it because those are kind of representations. In China, it was done through nasal insufflation. Kind of like how you snort cocaine, the nasal membrane is a very porous way to introduce substances into your body. And in India, it was like either here, like a tika with the origins of the word, but more frequently in your upper arm. And then this lady, I love this website, which you should know, called womenyoushouldknow.net. And they talk about this woman who actually then took variolation from the Turkish hammams to Britain. And that's where the royal family got variolated. So Jenner's father was a variolator. Jenner's big thing was to realize that cowpox maidens were the most beautiful women in England. And so he realized, well, why are they so beautiful? Oh, they never get smallpox. Why don't they get smallpox? Oh, because they get cowpox. And so what he did was he substituted like what would have been Sandhya's old pox matter with a cowpox scab. It's a very mild disease if you're a human, quite nasty if you're a cow. But they basically kind of, essentially just substituted it, which is why the word is variola vaccinae, which is like variola from the cow. And that's the word for vaccination today, which essentially is the Latin word for cow. Sorry, it's a very long explanation for a very good question.
Good answer.
But yeah, and that's why if you look at the earliest anti-vaccination posters, they spoke about how the vaccine would lead you to develop a snout or horns. And it had to do with the fact that they thought you were basically becoming part cow. Okay. So this vaccine comes to China and India through the East India Company. And, so I'll be talking about Calcutta and Canton, but it's this, I'm trying to make the case that this is a good comparison because it's quite similar in the kind of mill idea of, case comparisons. Of course, there are plenty of differences. So the theory, which I'll try to kind of be concise but clear, is that I argue that across these cases, not just Canton and Calcutta, but the part that I will not share with you today, which is 1950s China and 1950s to 70s India, there's something about differences in the moral relationship between state and society. I'm really using moral as almost a residual category for non-rational. And you can push back against it, but I don't mean moral as ethical, as you'll see in a second. It's really more about thinking of humans as not just driven by strategic cost-benefit maximization. So ideas of rule, so a lot of political scientists have said, and we tend to forget, that what states choose to focus or not focus on is a, quote, moral and political choice, right? So state scope is defined by the way in which we think about what the state should be doing, and that has varied a lot over time. So ideas of rule really influence state commitment to health. And, only because we've just had public health experts enter the house, I'll say that ideas of rule influence both the extent of state commitment to health, which is, for instance, operationalized as spending per capita. Sandhya has written a lot about this, about how India has, in the post-independence period, really, really frugal allotments, but also the nature of state commitment, right? So the idea of rule influences which diseases become important, which groups of people are seen as deserving of healthcare or seen as risk or seen as carriers. So just to give you an example, I argue that in 1950s India, I call it high modernity. It's basically a kind of scientific, secular, technical idea of rule that dominates. And what it leads to is, on the one hand, a kind of very, very low state commitment to health, as a lot of people here at CSEP have written about, but also within that state commitment, because it is this highly technocentric idea, what become emphasized are those diseases technical fixes. So what does India focus on? Coming back to our discussion about scars, BCG, which is actually at that time not even a universal vaccine around the world. So it's pretty odd that India would do it. BCG, malaria because of DDT spraying, and smallpox. So those diseases that have technical fixes, and again, because I argue that part of this high modernity was a very casteist neo-Malthusian fear of overpopulation, particularly reproduction of the wrong types, family planning. So you see, I mean, it's quite interesting because people tend to forget it, but India's ideas of rule, this kind of high modernity, scientific, technical idea of rule led to a focus on family planning in the 1950s. Remember, it was called the Ministry of Health and Family Planning. The family planning gets dropped only post-emergency when it becomes seen as kind of so coercive that they have to drop it. Mao was against family planning. And now when we think of China's coercive one-child policy, it's easy to forget that. But he said, look, the population is an asset. Why would we engage in family planning? And at the background of that, I think, are these very important but underemphasized differences in the ideas of rule. So ideas of rule really shape whether or not, or the extent to which a state commits. They also influence the dynamics of provision. Who and how? So in the Chinese, in like this logic of the idea of rule, which I call a kind of mix of hybrid modernity. So there's a bit of communism, but as most people who work on China will tell you, the communism is nationalism communism. The who of provision is not so much the state or the bureaucracy, it's the party. It's the CCP cadres who are embedded in the people. And so the how of health provision is a logic of what I call logical mobilization. While in India, the who are technical experts. You see this again and again in the archives. It's all about training. It's about, the experts. The focus is really on professional expertise, and the logic of provision is one of the bureaucracy and not one of mobilization. Nehru was quite open about it. He says, look, we're trying to kind of engage in community development with a tool that is not meant to mobilize, which is the bureaucracy. And so you read in his letters in which he says, what happened to the Congress? And he says, the only time I seem to see my party is when the elections come around. Why can't we use the party as a tool of mobilization? So he's quite self-conscious, but also in some way helpless around the fact that India again and again defaults into thinking that health should be provided by people who are trained, who are experts, and should be provided by the logic of bureaucratization rather than mobilization. So, and just to say, because there are people here who work on education, is part of why I think why I'm excited by the argument is because I think health and education in some ways are inseparable, but not in the way that you would usually think. So if ideas of rule influence what states think they should and shouldn't do, of course, it influences whether they commit to welfare and health. They also make a difference to whether they think they need to imprint themselves on the imagination of the people. What do I mean by this? So Pierre Bourdieu has this really nice idea of symbolic power in which the state is actually trying to make itself known through weights and measures, through coins, through, you might call it propaganda or education campaigns, in which the state kind of becomes almost acculturated into the everyday life of the people. And Migdal has this thing, he says, have state leaders and their agencies sought to change those that they rule from disconnected subjects of state rule to a status that their personal identities are linked to the continuation of the state. Now, it's a wordy quote, but I think eventually it gets down to whether or not we can call it nation building, but the states are committed to socializing their citizens. And here, India's absolute neglect of primary education, and in particular, the neglect of any kind of state-sponsored curriculum to create quote-unquote citizens, actually has a ramification for health. And the reason, the way that it does, I think, is because it basically means that the Indian state stands in an absolutely non-embedded relationship to the people. I mean, it's a funny thing to say because India, of course, emerges independent from a nationalist movement, a popular nationalist movement, but I would argue that there's actually a failure to nation build in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that leads to a lack of popular cooperation with state campaigns, such that the state always remains above, top down. Not that I'm arguing that the Chinese state is none of those things, but there's a big difference because of the focus on elementary education and also on the institution of the CCP and the communist cadres that allow the state to have this real affective language with which it can speak to the people that I argue did not exist in the 50s and 60s. Okay, very quickly, the basic argument is for popular cooperation, whether or not people cooperate has a lot to do with how they see the intervention. Do they see the institution as morally embedded? That's the part I was talking about. And do they see the intervention itself as morally embedded? That I'll talk to you. I'm going to skip over this just very quickly because I'm looking at the time. But I'm going to say that, history matters. So of course, all of this is happening analytically at this point in time, TN. What has happened in the past makes a big difference. And so if the state has already been active in the domain of health in the previous period, that creates a certain normative expectation for people that the state should be doing this. And so that matters. But also if the state has been really trying to imprint itself upon the imagination of the people, as I argue the Chinese state was doing way before communism, that also makes a difference to the degree of affective embedding. So it's a it's a little complicated, and I'm sorry that I'm still in the process of trying to communicate it more concisely than I have right now. But hopefully it'll become a little clearer when we get into the empirics. Yeah, I'm gonna skip over this all to say that the embedding of the intervention, I argue, happens by linking it to prior knowledge. So sociologists talk a lot about how we don't actually understand new information as new. We only understand it when we can link it to existing ways of thinking about it. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel some years ago, in Thinking Fast and Slow kind of has the popular version of it, but a lot of his experiments talk about this idea of cognitive consonance. So and Leon Festinger says, so for instance, in post-Second World War, he wanted to get Americans to visit Europe to kind of, buoy their flagging economies. He wanted them to try new culinary delights. And so he always said, look, try frog legs because they taste just like chicken legs. And then he had this big footnote about this kind of theory based on which he was saying this, which had to do with this kind of preference for the familiar. And so I argue that the embedding of the intervention matters as well. And that has to do with whether or not the vaccine can be linked to the existing folk cultural ritual ways in which a disease is understood. Sorry, that's a lot. But this is your mandatory 2x2 if you're a political scientist. The highest likelihood of success happens when you have both the moral embeddedness of the institution, which is the state frontline, but also the moral embeddedness of the intervention. And I argue that that upper left quadrant is what you will see very quickly in the city of Canton. I'm going to skip over this, but you should believe me that they're good comparisons because they're epidemiologically similar. They are actually politically pretty similar. A lot of people think that, China is so ethnically homogeneous, India is not, and that's a big difference. Turns out, actually, linguistically, for anyone who's visited, it's really quite diverse, and Canton was quite diverse. And so I'm trying to kind of set up why I think this is a good city comparison. This is a really shitty work of art. It's from the Peabody Essex Museum, north of Providence, where I teach. But the interesting thing is these people are called the Money Brothers. They're actually called the Money Brothers. They work for the British East India Company. And of course, Canton and Calcutta are the two places that the Money Brothers are pointing to on the map, which tells you also how important these two cities were for the tea, opium, silver trade that was essentially at this point the lifeblood of imperial colonialism. So they're politically important cities. They have high infectious disease burdens. The big difference is that the vaccine comes, as I told you, at exactly the same point in time. Canton sees a pretty rapid acceptance of this vaccine. 85% by most gazetteer accounts are vaccinated by 1850. In Calcutta, people like David Arnold will tell you that even into the early 19th century, vaccination rates remain in kind of single figures. So the question is why? And I'm going to try to say that it's this model that I've presented it to you analytically. So, the basic contours of it are actually quite similar to Canton and Calcutta. In Canton, it's an imperial Qing commitment to welfare and health. And it's provided through what are called the gentry, through at dispensaries and traveling vaccinators. In India, it is the East India Company that decides to promote vaccines. They do it quite similarly at dispensaries and traveling vaccinators. The big difference is that there's a fair degree of popular enthusiasm in Canton and a relative degree of apathy in Calcutta. So what is going on? And I want to argue to you that, to get back to that ideas of rule business, so Confucianism kind of creates this kind of really strong commitment because the core principles of Confucianism are nourish, teach, and govern. And this is the kind of ruling ideology that at this point in time has been in place for quite a few centuries. And so what does it mean for state scope? It means that welfare is very much within the public mandate. In fact, if you don't, you kind of you lose what is called the mandate of heaven. And also critically education, because of the fact that like teaching, guiding, inculcating Confucian principles is a really important core principle of the idea of rule. I won't get into this question of all under heaven as to leads to this kind of delegation, but it's quite different from legalism. So just because, you know, people often think, okay, if China was not Confucian, what else was it? It had before Confucianism a very different philosophy called legalism, which thought of humans as inherently selfish, not capable of being educated. And so it actually is quite similar to kind of, you know, the JPAL, you know, strict surveillance and punishment of rewards kind of system. It's very strategic. And so Confucianism comes in place of legalism and says, no, humans are not always inherently selfish. They can actually be taught. They can be made Confucian. And that's a real, and you know, the most effective punishment is not Ching, which is punishment, but it is actually instruction, which is Li. And so they really move away from legalism to kind of a way of thinking about human nature and therefore their duty or obligation towards the people that's very different. So legalism is really all about these kind of amazingly elaborate laws by which people are to be coerced, but almost no emphasis, for instance, on education. Okay, so Confucianism leads the state to both focus on welfare and health, but also, of course, through these Confucian academies and civil service exams, it really makes Confucianism known to the people, such that, you know, it is when we talk about the word Confucian society, the way that that's realized is through this very, very core institutional component. Why does this matter for popular cooperation? Because it creates what I call this affective embedding, but the affective embedding is complemented by this normative embedding because basically Confucianism took root after legalism in 200 CE. And so the Chinese state, by the time the vaccine comes around, has been committed to both welfare, but also to the socialization of its citizens for many thousands of years. So the institution is very clearly morally embedded. It is seen as normatively expected to focus on health. And the intervention is morally embedded as well. What does this mean? So in China, in Canton, when the vaccine comes, it's introduced by the East India Company, in particular, the Surgeon General, Alexander Pearson, writes this kind of introduction to the Jennerian vaccine. Jenner was not a disinterested scientist. He was an entrepreneur. He really wanted his vaccine to kind of spread across the world. But in China, they said, well, there's really no need to kind of have this be a foreign import. And so they spent a lot of money to kind of, in a way, vernacularize this vaccine, which I think is very critical to its acceptance. So this is a very popular manual that was sold in a very thriving print market, along with almanacs, horoscopes, calendars, you know, remedies for coughs and colds, ways to ward off evil spirits. So there's a whole kind of market for these kinds of, you know, low print, popular almanacs. And this is one that becomes really popular because there are 66 editions circulating in various libraries of the world. And what it does is this kind of moral embedding of the vaccine. It changes the title, gets rid of this whole Kingdom of England business. It adopts the writing style of traditional Chinese medicine texts. It introduces a theory. Remember, Jenner had no theory as to how the vaccine worked. It was just, oh, you got cowpox, you didn't get smallpox. It adds all of this dietary and ritual protocol. It also adds a bunch of herbal formulas. And critically, it needs to habilitate the incision because remember, I told you that variolation was insufflation through the nose. And so now you have an incision into the arm that also of an animal element into the body, which the gentry realize is likely to be met with opposition. And so they take great pains to embed and articulate the vaccine as a form of meridian acupuncture. So they both recruit acupuncturists, which is a very well-known technology at the time, to actually become vaccinators. And then they essentially kind of like create this entire meridian acupuncture architecture of theories to get the vaccine to be embedded within traditional Chinese medicine. This does not happen in Calcutta, and I'm just gonna say you should take my word for the fact that colonial modernity, which is the underlying idea of rule, does not allow for such a moral embedding to take place. In fact, they're at pains to make a distinction. I'm not going to get into this. They're at pains to make a distinction between variolation, which they now condemn as backward and dangerous, and vaccination, which is now seen as a symbol of European benevolence and superiority. So they have no incentives to embed and vernacularize the vaccine the way that the Chinese did it within existing systems. And so, you know, the other part of it, of course, there's a British component of it, but I also want to say that, you know, before the British came along, there was a very strict separation of state and society in India. This was not Confucian China. This was a caste society. So health was very much within the domain of caste, kin, and traditional healers that were completely separate from the state. The state was involved in taxation and very minimal law and order. There was no place for the state beyond that, as Sudipto Kaviraj and others have argued. And so what this meant was that the British were actually at a real disadvantage in some ways because their intervention of the vaccine was almost like a normative aberration. They didn't know what to do with it because, you know, so I won't get into it, but, you know, if you look at rumor in the colonial archive, it's very interesting because that's how you hear voice of the people. And so I collated all the rumors related to vaccination in these vaccination generals reports. And what you see, people like David Arnold would say it was resisted as a tool of the body, a tool of empire or a colonization of the body. But if you actually look at the rumors, you realize there's almost no reference to the English or the British or to Christianity. You know, there is a huge kind of suspicion of this, what I might call the malevolent intent of the British, but really critically, they keep thinking, oh, it's a way to tax us more. And for me, that to me is a proxy for the fact that they're really questioning the normative authority of the state. So the way that they understand it is, oh, well, what should the state be doing? It should be taxing us. And so if it's coming around with this vaccine, it must be, they're trying to understand it within their kind of existing way of understanding what the state should be doing in terms of its kind of normative role vis-a-vis society. You know, I'm happy to talk more about that. They don't effectively embed it. They get rid of all the dietary protocols. They get rid of the seasonality. Smallpox was also called Basant because it happened in the spring. They're like, why? So where in China it was like embedded within the existing rituals, here it was actually quite violently shorn of them. And Harish Narayan Das, from whom this is drawn, has a really interesting set of articles about it. Okay. Just to say that eventually, and you can see this, right? So in the archives, you see this is the superintending surgeon who says, you know, the principal objection to vaccination is it's done without any puja, it's done without any sacrificial offering. And again, they point to how this raw secularity of vaccination is a major impediment to its acceptance. Okay, I'm going to end by essentially just telling you that when it was accepted, it was interesting. People would hire a priest. They would get Ganga water. They would actually maintain the old rituals and taboos. So they would pay extra to have all of this ritual layered back onto vaccine. One of the kind of USPs of which was, though it was supposed to be easy and simple and didn't require a pandit and it didn't require the ritual. And it turns out actually that when it was accepted, people kind of found informal, ad hoc, individual ways to do the moral embedding that was happening at a much more kind of societal level in China. I could tell you a lot about the 1950s. I could tell you how, you know, something happens in China that has to do with moral embedding, but this time it's nationalism. It's the patriotic health campaigns. Vaccination is a way to protect the Chinese body when America is basically allegedly engaging in germ warfare. This is really interesting. That last poster forms the template for their COVID vaccination poster. So it's very much like a patriotic duty for me that this is another form of moral embedding. In the 19th century, it was linking it to traditional Chinese medicine. In the 20th century, it's linking it to kind of nationalism, both of which to me are forms of moral embedding. Interesting because Priyadarshini mentioned this, you know, eventually, so in chapter 6, which is about eventually India eradicates smallpox with a whole lot of help from the CDC and from the WHO. So, you know, these foreign epidemiologists and vaccinators are running all over the Indian countryside. And this moment at which they decide to to basically have the smallpox vaccination campaigns in the precincts of Sitla Mata temples is an important turning point in the vaccination campaign, because they realize that people will, of course, hide from them, but they will not hide from the goddess. This was interesting because it was reports of vaccination camps happening at abandoned and repurposed Sitla temples during the COVID pandemic. I think this has lots of implications for contemporary public health, but I'm going to keep quiet, except to say that, people keep talking about why facts don't change our minds. That's a New Yorker cover from a few years ago. And it talks about how you keep giving people more facts about vaccines and it actually increases their resistance to vaccines. And so, the way that I think about it is, rather than focusing on why facts don't change our minds, let's think of all those ways that we do know change people's minds and that are actually relatively underexplored. But I apologize for taking more than I thought I would, and thanks for your attention.
I know Lavish has to head out, so if you have any questions for her, I'm happy to. Yes. Okay.
No, I'm happy to. I'm really happy.
Yes.
To.
But I'm going to start off with
Should we get
sort of, please.
Yeah.
I mean, if I know.
This is amazing, fascinating job. And really, there's far more food for thought than I thought we would have. And I think we need another conversation on this, especially on some of our work that we are doing. I think especially on education. In fact, that the point that you were making about embedding things in the cultural norms, I'm actually quite struck by that, both in health and in education. The fact that the state traditionally was not directly a part of it, I think this is a fascinating point, and that needs. But just one issue here. When I go and I talk to villagers, the entity they have the most faith in terms of both healthcare and education, is the state.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, and I think, just to kind of say that I absolutely agree, right? Like, so this is the point about the difference between the normative authority and the affective authority. I mean, interesting that you use the word trust, right? I might ask you to say, would you really say that the people that they have the more trust in, or the greatest expectation from? I think okay, so in the COVID pandemic, the one finding that was so strong was that the single most important predictor of whether or not you would accept the COVID vaccine was trust in the state. Right, this was across all of it. So I think, sorry, shows my eyes are so bad. I can't tell you what all I put on the X and the Y axis. But I think that is that trust in state?
Yeah.
Okay, trust in police. Yes. So various indicators of trust in state institutions. This is from World Values Survey, which is really quite terrible, like questions, but we are stuck with them. So you see here kind of generally positive associations between trust in state, and those are immunizations, various immunizations on the Y-axis. So you're right in that the greater trust you have in the state, the more likely you are across the world to kind of get vaccinated. My question is, where does trust come from? And I think there historically the relationship between states and societies matters. And so for me, one way to kind of answer that question is to say, well, if that is the case, that the institution that they trust the most is the state, then how is it that we kind of shore up that trust in the state? And to not have it simply be, oh, how does the state provide, but how do we get people to kind of come on board with state schemes? And so one of, I think, the implications of this argument would be, what are the ways in which we can morally embed the state? Now, of course, I recognize as I say that there's a kind of dark side to that. Like, by morally embedding an intervention, are we kind of supporting and condoning and encouraging, like, sometimes regressive patriarchal practices, or actually dangerous, like, traditional medicine? But to me, it's really interesting that the Indian state has, especially in its early decade, really shied away from making any kinds of links between traditional systems of medicine, that I think was to its detriment. So Mao was also, Mao at the end of the day was also a modernizer. So he was very skeptical about traditional Chinese medicine, but realized that these were the people who commanded the trust and the faith of the villagers. And so he kind of does a volte-face and says, okay, we can make these people part of our vaccination teams, part of our barefoot doctors. And so when we look even at a measure like number of doctors per capita, that's a measure that's constructed by who you are willing to say is a quote unquote, health worker versus who's a quack. And so I don't know, that's like not the perfect answer in a way, but I would love to continue the conversation. But I think to me, I agree with you that there is a great expectation from the state in India, really through the post-independence decades, and maybe great faith and trust, if we may say so. But the question is, how do we kind of shore up that trust? And yeah, maybe that was a problem in earlier decades more than now, but I do think that there's a way in which we can, yeah, I mean, like, I just think of the way in which climate policy becomes much more acceptable in America when it gets framed in biblical terms.
But just one more question. Are you familiar with the literature, and it's the economics literature mostly, on how policies can change culture? Are you familiar with that literature?
I know a bit, but I would love to get more citations. Yeah.
Okay, so I just building on to Lavish's point, I just wanted to come in with an interjection. So obviously, your argument is highlighting how in the Chinese case, it was building on centuries of distrust building between the state and the people, a certain kind of political culture, which didn't happen in the case of India. And bringing this argument to very here and now, to our contemporary public health and education challenges. Are you making a case that we need more stronger public provision of health and education, and that's the missing link? Because obviously the state contemporarily is a lot more visible, is a lot more present than it was during the 50s and 60s.
Right.
But also the public space is receding increasingly, both in the space of health and education. So if you're saying that people have to, the state has to embed itself, is the embedding going to happen through stronger public institutions, a frontline state that is more sort of effective and decentralized and linked with the local actors, your civil society, is that what this really means for where we are today?
Yeah, no, it's a great
Prerna,
question.
can I
Yeah.
just, sorry, add to the question Priyadarshini's put on the
Yeah,
table.
sure.
Given that India has experienced years of mistrust, distrust, whatever you want to call it, how possible is it to build this trust now?
Yeah. No, it's a good one.
It's a
Should we
sticky
collect a few
question.
questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Daljit and then Shruti.
Yeah, I'm I don't want to say push back, but I have I'm not so sure I agree with you that there was, you're saying, I'm assuming going to use the word trust. My own sense is that the trust in government was much more in the 50s and even the 60s, but it's eroded now.
For sure.
And because I still, and of course, people did the wrong, this whole thing about there was no focus on primary education and so on. I think that was because our leaders were all really from the elite class. I mean, Nehru, he went to school at Harrow. I think he could barely speak Hindi. And so that's what led to him to focus on the IITs and things like that, but not on primary education. But there was a real, the sense, what I remember is that there was a real affection for people. And just very shortly, because I remember when Nehru died, and there was just, the kids around me, there was a real sense of very personal loss. So this is, again, I don't have the data, I don't have the literature. I'm just giving you a sense of what it was.
Okay, Shruti?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor. That was excellent. And as a person, as a political scientist who studies India and China, I was nerding out big time. But my question is more political science. So how is this theory different from the idea of the social contract? One could also claim that the relationship that the Chinese and the Indian states have with their people, based on these very similar ideas of Confucianism or a liberal democratic state, why is that explanation not enough? And where does your explanation sit in that theory? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, anyone else in this round? Sorry, I don't, yeah, and then the lady here.
Yeah, so my question is, in the recent years, there has been a lot of focus on traditional systems of medicine. For example, we have the Ministry of Ayush, and there is a promotion of Ayurveda, yoga, and the practitioners we have in these domains may not be well qualified to deal with all the issues in public health space. So while we are talking about embedding culture with public health, provisioning of public health, how do we address these dangers that may come along with this?
Okay, all right.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I just want to back up to say that, you know, obviously I'm talking about vaccination, which is, and I think here the empirics matter, which is a very basic procedure. You know, so I mean, if this was hysterectomies or like, you know, some other medical procedure, I'm not sure that the same argument about, you know, necessarily kind of getting traditional healers as part of your health worker corps would necessarily hold. So there is a kind of boundedness to the argument, mostly here because of the kind of relative simplicity of the technology. I mean, and at the end of the day, you know, in the 60s, a lot of the people who were vaccinating were being trained for like 2-3 hours in a camp. And then being sent out. So thanks for actually allowing me to make that distinction. But only other thing I'll say in response to that is, of course, now the way that Ayush and all are patronized is quite different, at least if you look at the counterfactual of what could have happened, which we don't really focus on, which is that there was a way in which the state could have, you know, I'm not saying that you take these people as they are out in the wild, right? But it's more kind of getting back to political sciencey terms, it's more about kind of a kind of co-production, right? To kind of use an Eleanor Ostrom vocabulary, or synergy. So the state could have invested, as for instance, the Chinese state did, or interestingly, you know, the American state kind of works a lot with midwives who are also kind of technically a part of civil society, going back to Priyadarshini's argument. So there was a way in which the state could have actively worked to kind of create these links with para-state, non-state, civil society actors to kind of, you know, create these connections that would have not necessarily made them, you know, you could have, like, you know, trained them. So I'm not saying that we kind of, yeah. So I think the point about that Sandhya and actually, let me get to you. So I think there's a difference. I agree with you that there was a great degree of affection for Nehru, and I actually agree with everything you've said. I think the difference, though, and that strikes me, is if you go to the archives, so the smallpox eradication campaign through the 50s and 60s, until it became this intensified program, which allowed the WHO and the CDC to come in, was part of the community development program. If you read the archives of the CDP, which, as you know, was India's flagship rural development program, you are struck by how the dominant strain is that of hand-wringing around, you know, what they call popular apathy, lack of involvement, and a very quick resort to kind of neo-colonial terms like the backward villager, the superstitious villager. So all to say that, you know, there you can literally see in the archives a frontline bureaucracy and a state struggling, and we are reading the archive on their own terms, with questions of mobilization. And they will actually actively articulate it in exactly those phrases. You know, they say, we have the skills, and, you know, the CDP is also doing, for instance, agriculture. The large part of this is agricultural modernization. And they're like, oh, you know, we've brought the techniques, we've brought the seeds. Why won't the quote unquote backward villager change his ways? It's always like this patriarchal kind of, so, you know, so I think I agree with you that there is a kind of popular affection, there is a kind of powerful residue of the nationalist movement. But I think the failure is eventually ideas only go so far as the institutions that take them. And I think that the problem was that there was no institutional conduit for the kind of creating of this affective link to the state in the way that the CCP cadres continued to do. So, I mean, the CCP cadres like continued to be more active in China in some ways in the 50s and 60s than they were before the revolution. So, you know, but we didn't quite have that kind of association, which again goes back to this point about the role of civil society or a non-state actor. And then to get to kind of, you know, in a way, Sandhya's point is, you know, so how do we do this? And how does it, and I think here I've been struck, but I don't know enough about it. So I really defer to the public health experts, to ASHA workers. Like if I kind of think of an example of like when it feels, at least in my reading of the secondary scholarship, that the state is able to create what I might call a kind of moral relationship that has allowed a certain degree of mobilizational logic to enter, it seems as if it has happened through ASHA workers. I'm not quite sure what the dynamics of that are, but I think I'm really interested in kind of finding those pockets in which the state has been able to create those moral connections and therefore kind of in a way, churn this mobilizational logic around it. I mean, I think maybe polio vaccination could be another instance of it in which, but you know, Devesh Kapoor has this kind of interesting thing in which he says that the Indian state does things that happen in mission mode and only once in a while really well. Where it falters is the everyday. I have a slightly different take on that, in which I have this graph in which so Lant Pritchett has this thing in which he says, this paradox that how can a state that regularly launches orbiting satellites as part of a well-developed space program, how can it not get a large proportion of its people to not defecate in public? And the kind of corresponding, in a way, paradox for China is that how can a state that can institute such disastrous macroeconomic policies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, how can it continue to gain popular mobilization? And so another way to kind of think about it is, you know, if this is an X, Y axis in which the green are tasks that require kind of really good policy making, then India does really well on those tasks, right? Like we're the leaders of the non-aligned movement. We're the ones sending Mahalano base and all to China to set up like the Statistical Commission in China. Arunam Ghosh at Harvard, my former colleague, has a great book on the role of Indian planners in setting up China's 5-year plans, right? So all those things we do very well, but it's in that red quadrant where we require popular compliance that we seem to kind of struggle. Now, within that, I've taken out like the elections and the census, and Devesh would say the Kumbh Mela, because those are like, you know, what he says, mission mode type of things that the Indian state does quite well. You know, interesting because China is in some ways, and here I want to again bound it by saying I'm really talking more about the 50s and 60s, in which they have crazy policies, right? Like the idea that you can kind of have industrialization by smelting iron in your backyard. I mean, that's a harebrained scheme. So I think it does much worse in terms of the policy making, but where it seems to do really well is that kind of bottom right space, which is popular mobilization. So in some ways, the kind of tragedy of the Great Leap Forward is that it was such a harebrained scheme that gained this incredible degree of popular mobilization. Of course, there's coercion because it's the 50s, but a lot of people in China will tell you that at that point in time, they were so gutted from both the Civil War and the Japanese invasion that they didn't, like, we project retrospectively the contemporary coercive capacity of the Chinese state into the 50s and 60s. They didn't really have that then. So I think there really was something genuine about people coming on board. Oh, that's a great question. I don't have a great answer, and I'd love to chat with you offline. But all to say that, like, you know, part of it is I don't want to say that China does everything well and India does everything badly, because there's something fixed and unchanging about the social contract, which is why I find like the ASHA worker example and other times when India can buck this general characterization and do things well quite interesting. I find the Kumbh really interesting, but I think part of why we do the Kumbh well is because it is morally embedded, and I think that's a difference in a way, but also to say that China has a lot of difference with schistosomiasis, which is the snail fever campaign, and it's because it's seen as disrupting feng shui. So, you know, like there is a way in which they have to back up, and it's not, I don't want to kind of assume that everything that China does is automatically morally embedded and therefore leads to compliance. And so I've been actively seeking out these examples in which sometimes actually the Chinese state can't do what it wants to do. Yeah.
One is on the public health side.
Okay, thanks. Sorry. Okay. On the public health side, I have a question first. Would you take the argument that if we look at current strategy, we can look at COVID, we can look at the introduction of health and wellness centers and the ASHA program, which is earlier from 2005, that actually it was an attempt for the state to build trust through the health system, as opposed to what you're saying, that this was actually built externally in a way,
question.
because that's what I see. And interestingly, a lot of the terms that you mentioned, like rumors, there's a lot of public health strategy that is now specifically on that. Like, can we use rumors?
Yeah.
Can we use, how do we build trust, but through health? as opposed to seeing health as sort of separate, which is how I understood the argument, and apologies. Second question I have is, how does this relate to what you're saying to your own earlier arguments around social solidarity at the state level? And the fact that different states have really performed better in India on health and education because of a social solidarity that was not only state-driven, that was actually cultural as well, because there was a similar language, et cetera, like in Tamil Nadu. So,
Take one more, Alok, and then Sandhya.
yeah.
Best and the worst thing to have smart women in the audience, huh?
Alok, and then Sandhya.
So I have been wondering for a while that, India has built a wonderful, institutional arrangement, not just in rural India, but in urban India also. And to the panchayat level, to the block level in our urban areas. And despite that, we have not been able to produce results that what we seek for. So the moral embeddedness that you were saying, or the embeddedness of intervention into the community, I mean, have you think about it, that why we are not able to produce the desired results, despite, such deep interventions to the communities? Thank you.
Sandhya.
Quick question, Prerna. Actually, it was such a rich presentation. I thought there'd be hundreds of questions in my head, but just one or two right now. So wondering, when we talk about the absence of trust with respect to the state and moral embeddedness, to what extent is the inability to actually deliver something effectively playing a role? Which you did mention state capacity, because you mentioned here, we're very good at planning and we've gone and planned systems for China, etc. So the planning may be there, but then the provision or the implementation isn't there. And that's where, to what extent is the inability to deliver well playing a role? And another quick thought, and we can talk about it later, is the notion of nationalism. When you look across the world, so many countries, when they became democratized or became a different type of nation, welfare was a key part of that national identity.
Yeah, for sure.
Why did that not happen in India as India emerged?
Yeah. Those are really, really great questions. I'll start with sorry, is there another one? You should ask. No, you should ask, really.
Thank you. Fascinating. Two questions. One, I was wondering about also the legitimacy of the state. I mean, you're talking about capacity, and where does that come in? And I feel like maybe the British Raj and the Qing dynasty in China probably had very different levels in how that plays in. The second, actually, a lot of what you said resonated with even with this paper that we did on adaptive governance. And there, picking up from points that were made earlier, we framed this, what you called moral embeddedness, actually as a process of negotiation. And building on what Sapna said, through the policies, the institutions, as well as the workforce, the frontline workforce, including the ASHA workers, as mechanisms to build this negotiation, both going from the bottom up on values, which coalesce around sort of a negotiated common minimum program, so to speak, on what the ideas that what you call the ideas of rule, I think. And then also back downwards to allow some of these institutions and also the workforce to actually be able to use their own agency to tweak it on the ground. So sort of this process of negotiation up and down the state through the existing health system. And I wondered what you thought about it and whether it actually did sort of, there were any parallels to the kinds of things that you were saying.
Yeah, and those are a really an excellent set of questions and such resonances across them. So I agree in the way that I presented it right now. It really feels as if trust is created independent of the health domain. It's created, of course, in interaction with the state and society, but I mean, I just want to say that I absolutely agree with you. In fact, in some ways, a kind of important text going back to my political science roots is Judith Tendler, when she talks about health workers in Sierra and Brazil, right? And she talks about that, it's called Good Governance in the Tropics. And she's talking about an example of how in a case when we would expect everything to fail, you actually see this instance of a really functioning health program. And part of it is the creation of trust through this negotiation process that you're mentioning. Sorry, I didn't get your name. Niti, that Niti was mentioning, that you know, it is very much created through these interactions. And so I think that absolutely, I think I still need to kind of incorporate that into the theoretical model. But you know, part of my pushback, part of the reason why it's not in the model is because, again, political scientists would reduce trust. They would say, like, for them, it's not so much this negotiation. It has to do in some ways with what you're saying, Sandhya, which is delivery. So they say, well, trust is a little bit like a quid pro quo. If you received something in the past, it leads you to trust the state. And they use World Values Survey data in which you have a question, did you receive a service from the state? And then they have a question, do you have trust in the state? And look at those associations to make a case. When actually you go back, and I've actually done this quite a bit, mostly to like convince myself that this isn't actually the case, is that I don't know if I have this, sorry, yeah, okay. So I call it the exchange theoretic. So Sandhya, one way to think about what you're saying, which I'm not saying is the way that you're saying it, but the way that they say it is that that trust basically is a product of the efficacy of the state and of what you get from the state. And so these are these questions. For instance, on the x-axis, how often have you gone without food? On the y-axis, trust in government. And you can see it's a pretty flat line, right? And my problem with such arguments is that if we reduce trust to this exchange theoretic way of saying it's a quid pro quo, then that condemns large parts of the global south to this vicious cycle of lack of provision and mistrust. Right? And so I have a normative problem with these kinds of arguments, most of which emerge from scholars in the global north. And to them say, okay, of course, that's part of the story, right? Like if the state continues to be ineffective, it loses legitimacy, it erodes trust. But I think I'm interested in how is it that even in a context, say we are to say of low provision or you know, how is it that that trust can be created? And maybe the answer is through this kind of negotiated embeddedness. And so this is where, I mean, thanks for pushing me, because it's kind of where my thinking is in terms of, you know, I managed to get the health domain into it by saying the longer a state has been active in health, the greater normative authority it has in kind of asking people for what are quite costly sacrifices in the name of health. You know, that's a lot of what public health interventions are. But I think to your point about why did welfare not become important to post-colonial India? I think this is a fascinating question. And for me, where ideas of rule become really important. So, you know, you see commitments to health and education all over all over the Constitutional Assembly debates. But then when it comes to putting your money where your mouth is, right, it all kind of stops. But what is even more interesting than you know, everyone talks about how India spends like what, 1, 2, 3% of its GDP on education, similar on health. It's really low for countries of its standard. But what's even more terrifying is the lopsidedness of it, right? We did have enough money to spend on higher education and technical education. We had enough money to set up AIMS, right? Like, which is kind of an incredible institution. We've all benefited from it. But imagine setting up an All India Institute of Medical Sciences with specialized medicine in a context in which, you know, you had the levels of maternal and infant mortality. And you again read Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, who becomes, of course, you know, a very important player in the WHO. And it is, I mean, it is completely saturated with these elitist, technocentric ideas of health. And so it's not that welfare doesn't figure in the Indian imaginary, it figures in this very peculiar way. And also to see the amount of money that is being devoted within a very paltry budgetary allocation to family planning. The obsession with family planning is really eye-opening. And to me, therefore, this idea of high modernity as being this really dangerous, I mean, quite incredible in one ways, but in other ways, quite, you know, dangerous cocktail of a technocentric idea along with a kind of this neo-Malthusian fear of the reproduction of the wrong types. I mean, it's easy to remember that the center of eugenics in the world was Bombay and not much of Western Europe. So, you know, and a lot of Indian nationalist leaders were quite supportive of eugenics programs and this kind of reproduction of the wrong types. And again, if you read the debates around education, that some people work with the mind, some people work with their hands. Myron Wiener's work on why child labor is not prohibited and primary education is neglected. I mean, this idea of this caste-based systems and caste anxieties is, I think these ideas of rule actually really help you understand the budgetary allocations. And because, that's like if you just see the budgetary allocations in India, it really is, it's quite striking.
That's super comprehensive. And I think we're going to just end with one last question by Tia.
I didn't answer your question, but can we talk? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much for a very interesting question. As someone who is interested in working at China-India comparative public health, I think I have a three-part question, but from a public health perspective.
Yeah.
One is, were there other agencies that worked in Canton at that time from your archive that have looked at extensively? Because I've looked at medical missionaries.
Yeah.
Work is very expensive on that part. So, and the first hospital that came was in Canton.
Exactly.
Anyways, was compared to other cities in China, they were very upfront when it comes to modern medicine or Western medicine, however you want to put it. Second question is coming back to the Malthusian argument again, living in a very neo-Malthusian world in the 1950s when a huge chunk of public health expenditure was spent on that front. India did the smallpox program, because I'm not very sure whether it was a vertical program or whether it was embedded international. So if it was, then did it suffer like the other disease, like the other vertical programs that it suffered? And in terms of coverage, in terms of vaccination, and what were the implications of that? I was interested in. And third thing is in terms of Calcutta. In my work, particularly when I looked at Calcutta and Beijing at institutions, so I found that when I looked at hookworm as a disease, most of the vaccinations that were, or immunization that were tried, were on controlled environment like plantations. So did smallpox also? Did they experiment like that with smallpox? And yeah, thank you so much.
It's really interesting because, like when I talk about colonial modernity, again, this actually is exactly related to Sandhya's point, is it's not just that post-colonial Indian priorities were skewed, that, on the one hand, there's a neglect of health, and within health, there's a real emphasis on certain things like, what I would call elite health or family planning. But even in the colonial period, so the general argument is that colonial modernity, right, was both colonial and modern. And the colonial part of it was, this is an extractive, it's a company. And so it has no investment in the health of the people. And so Sunil Amrit and others have written about this, that the kind of general story of colonial rule is, of course, a kind of really egregious and tragic neglect of the health of the Indian population. It's interesting that smallpox gets prioritized within that overall neglect for two reasons. One, smallpox kills Europeans, and Indians having smallpox risk European lives. So get to your point about where it begins. It begins in prisons, and it begins among the army, and it begins among Europeans. And then they kind of begin to spread it out to the population for both an instrumental and an ideational reason. The instrumental reason is because, they still kind of don't want smallpox circulating. But much more important is the fact that the smallpox vaccine is the first time, and they say this in the archives, that the British have anything that they can say is quote unquote superior to Indian medicine, right? Because a big break happens in India around the 1820s and 30s in the move from Warren Hastings to Macaulay, right? So Hastings is basically like commissioning materia medicas of India. He's learning from Ayurvedic doctors. He's kind of putting together all the Brahmins. He's opening a Sanskrit college of Calcutta. Then Macaulay and James Mill come and say, oh, it's about Western biomedicine. And so in some ways, the smallpox vaccine under Jenner becomes a real representation of European benevolence and European superiority. So in many ways, it is the first state intervention into people's bodies in India ever. But it happens, and I think you can only understand the peculiarity if you look at the kind of ideas of rule, which is colonialism leads them to neglect health, but their desire to civilize and civilizing mission impetuses lead them to kind of spread this one particular technology, which is a sign of European superiority. I'm happy to talk more about Canton, but I also am very cognizant of the clock that is right in front of me.
All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Prerna. You're really pushing us to think beyond policy making and policy implementation and staffing and HR to really see how the state and its interventions and its ideas really link with the lives of the people. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much for your patience. Yeah.